The desert smelled of burnt oil and scorched metal when the engine of Carlo Bianchi's Carro Armato M13/40 gave its final choking cough. The Italian tank, thin-skinned, riveted, and underpowered, had shuddered under the direct hit of an American M4 Sherman. A plume of black smoke poured upward into the Tunisian sky, twisting against the wind that carried with it the acrid hiss of burning rubber and the dry rasp of sand against metal. Carlo clutched his Carcano M91 rifle, though he knew it was pointless. The bolt was jammed with grit, the magazine half empty, and his stomach hollow from days of reduced rations. He was a soldier of the 47th Infantry Regiment, Royal Italian Army. Yet in that moment he felt more like a relic abandoned by history. Around him men climbed from trenches with white cloths raised, their faces gray with fatigue. The battle for Tunis, May 12, 1943, was ending, and with it, the North African campaign. When the Americans approached, Carlo braced for retribution. Mussolini's propaganda had filled their ears with stories of barbaric invaders, of Yankees who shot prisoners or treated them like animals. He tightened his grip on the rifle until a sharp commanding voice cut through the smoke. "Drop it, buddy. War's over for you." The words were English, but they carried no hatred. The sergeant, later Carlo learned his name was James O'Donnell of the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, offered not a bayonet, but a Hershey bar. The wrapper crinkled in Carlo's hand. He had not tasted chocolate since 1940, when war rationing had emptied Italian shelves of such luxuries. He broke a piece off with trembling fingers. The sweetness hit his tongue like a revelation, thick and rich against the bitterness of dust. Then came a can of peaches, syrup golden and heavy, running down his chin as if mocking the famine that shadowed his homeland. Behind them the Shermans rumbled forward, their engines low and confident. Each tank was heavier, faster, and infinitely more reliable than the Italian armor that had carried him to this futile front. Carlo had heard rumors that American factories produced hundreds of these machines every week, while Italy struggled to keep a dozen operational in the field. Standing there, syrup dripping from his lips, he realized the war had not only been lost in fire and steel, it had been lost in chocolate and peaches. Carlo lowered his rifle into the sand and raised his hands. In surrender, he tasted abundance. Far from the burning desert of Tunis, Major William Harris leaned over a cluttered desk in Algiers, his eyes scanning rows of requisition forms as though the numbers themselves could dictate victory. His war was measured not in bullets fired or tanks destroyed, but in tonnage delivered, in supply lines that stretched across oceans. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps called it supply discipline. But Harris knew it was the bloodstream of the war. Every blanket, every can of peaches, every bolt of cloth passed through his hands before reaching the front. The figures were staggering. A single Liberty ship, the emblem of American industrial ingenuity, could carry 10,000 tons of cargo. By 1943, more than 2,000 had been launched, each built in roughly 42 days on assembly lines that never stopped. The sheer scale was almost unimaginable to European planners who were still struggling to replace a handful of ships lost in the previous year's convoy battles. Harris had watched them rise from the docks like mechanical titans, each hull a promise that men, material, and supplies would reach the front, regardless of the storm or enemy U-boat lurking beneath the waves. Harris's task was not only to move supplies forward but to fill the return voyages efficiently. Empty ships were wasted ships, and inefficiency in logistics could cost more lives than bullets. When the order arrived to transport Italian prisoners from North Africa to the United States, Harris did not hesitate. Tens of thousands of men, mostly Italian, some German, would serve as ballast for the Atlantic crossing, their presence filling the holds and freeing room for tanks, rations, and construction materials on subsequent trips. The plan was meticulously calculated. Each POW would receive roughly 3,500 calories a day, the same as an American soldier. Blankets, clothing, and even soap were provided. Camp facilities across the Midwest, Atterbury, Hereford, and Letterkenny, were constructed to Geneva Convention standards, with adequate sleeping quarters, medical care, and work opportunities. It was generosity measured with precision, efficiency that would leave Axis officers aghast. Harris scribbled numbers in the margin: Liberty ships per convoy, tanks per shipment, tons of rations. Even in these sterile forms, he could see the magnitude of American industrial might. Factories back home were producing an M4 Sherman every 20 minutes, aircraft at a rate of thousands per month, and food in quantities that would feed tens of thousands of men without pause. In his mind, the war was being won not just on battlefields, but in offices like this, where paper and steel met human need. When he signed the last requisition form, he allowed himself a moment to visualize the journey. The prisoners would board the ships within days, crossing an Atlantic still threatened by the Kriegsmarine, and arrive in a land of farms, orchards, and factories humming at impossible speed. By the time they disembarked, the war would already feel different, not because their rifles had changed hands, but because the scale of American production made defeat inevitable. Major Harris leaned back, letting the numbers settle. Victory, he realized, could be served on a tray. In the narrow streets of Rome, the midday sun glinted off cracked plaster and shuttered windows, but it offered no warmth to the children huddled along the curb. Sister Angela moved quietly through the lines, ladling thin soup into dented tin bowls. The aroma was faint, mostly boiled vegetables with a hint of burnt bread, but it was all she had to offer. Italy, in 1943, was a nation strangled by war and scarcity. Ration cards measured out survival in ounces of bread, drops of milk, and fragments of meat that were often claimed by black market vendors before they reached the families. Angela's brothers were at the front, one with the Navy, another in the 47th Infantry Regiment, fighting in Tunisia. Every spoonful she distributed carried with it a silent prayer that her brothers had eaten that day, that they had survived the desert sun and American shells. Mussolini's speeches blared from loudspeakers, promising glory and empire, yet the reality of civilian hunger was undeniable. Rumors whispered of entire Italian divisions stranded in the desert, their tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, their rations evaporating before reaching frontline troops. Letters that arrived sporadically spoke of biscuits and canned cheese stretched beyond endurance. The contrast was stark. At home, the nation starved. At the front, soldiers fought with scraps, facing American tanks that rolled off assembly lines in staggering numbers. One report claimed that a single U.S. factory could produce in a day what Italy struggled to make in a month. The numbers seemed impossible, yet they were whispered among those who dared to listen. Sister Angela moved through the soup line, observing children with hollow cheeks, their eyes wide from hunger. She wondered what kind of country could muster such power across the seas. A democracy, she had heard, messy and chaotic, yet somehow capable of supplying armies and caring for prisoners in ways her own nation could not. The disparity gnawed at her. How could the enemy, the so-called soft Americans, wield such quiet, systematic strength while Italy's proud empire faltered? She did not yet know that her brother Carlo had surrendered near Tunis. She did not know that he had eaten chocolate peaches and fresh bread aboard a Liberty ship, that he would soon disembark on fertile American soil, well-fed and protected, while the streets of Rome remained thin and quiet. Her knowledge was limited to the sound of bells tolling from Santa Maria, the smell of boiled greens in the parish kitchen, and the harsh rhythm of war that had transformed her city into a place of waiting and fear. And yet, in the small hidden spaces of her heart, a question took root. Could a nation's strength be measured not only in guns and tanks, but in its capacity for provision, care, and ingenuity? Perhaps the answer lay across the sea, on the ships that carried prisoners into a world she had never seen. The bells rang again, their hollow echo drifting over the streets, marking the slow passage of hours that would carry her brother and thousands like him to a land where abundance had become a weapon of war. The Atlantic was a gray expanse of rolling waves when Carlo Bianchi first stepped onto the deck of the Liberty ship SS John W. Brown. Salt stung his nostrils, the wind shredded the thin fabric of his uniform, and the smell of brine mixed with engine oil and coal smoke. He gripped the rail, watching the horizon blur into mist, and for the first time since leaving Tunisia, he felt neither fear nor hunger, only awe. The ship was enormous, a floating cathedral of steel and cargo. Below deck, hundreds of Italian prisoners like him had been assigned bunks, modest but clean, stacked 3 high in the hold. Each man received blankets and 3 meals a day: bread, meat, fruit, and even chocolate. It was more than sustenance, it was a revelation. The desert rations, the weeks of hardtack and biscuits, the scraps that had defined their frontline experience, seemed a lifetime away. Carlo explored the ship cautiously, tracing the polished bulkheads and steel ladders. He noted the engines. Twin, triple expansion steam engines, each rated at 2,500 horsepower, capable of propelling the vessel at 11 knots even fully laden. Liberty ships had been built by the thousands, some in just 42 days, the product of an industrial machine whose output defied logic. Harris, the quartermaster, had mentioned it, but seeing it in motion made the numbers real. 1 ship, 1 engine room, and yet a single convoy could transport tanks, trucks, rations, and prisoners across oceans that had claimed empires. At night, Carlo lay on his bunk, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the propellers, the low hum of the boilers, and the occasional cry of gulls. Around him, conversations in broken English and Italian drifted through the steel corridors. Some men whispered about the American generosity, blankets, full meals, medical care, while others marveled at the scale of the operation. They had imagined cruelty, forced labor, or neglect. Instead, they found a nation capable of feeding its enemies as well as its own sons. Above deck, sailors adjusted rigging and checked lifeboats with meticulous precision. They spoke of convoys, of German U-boats lurking beneath the waves, yet their discipline conveyed confidence rather than fear. Carlo realized that the Americans did not just build ships, they built systems. Ships, trains, and factories were connected in a chain that delivered men and materiel faster than any Axis force could disrupt. By the time the sun rose on the second day, the coast of North America appeared faint and blue on the horizon. For many Italian prisoners, the sight was surreal. They had crossed thousands of miles, survived storms and mechanical groans, and now faced a land of plenty, a landscape so fertile that it could sustain armies while their homeland dwindled in hunger. Carlo returned to his bunk and unwrapped a piece of chocolate, tasting its sweetness with new understanding. Across the Atlantic, a democracy's industrial machine moved quietly, relentlessly, transforming raw materials into power, and soon he would witness it on land. The train slowed to a crawl, clattering over wooden trestles as it carried Carlo Bianchi and hundreds of Italian prisoners into the rolling hills of southern Indiana. Outside the window, the landscape unfolded in an almost surreal greenness, orchards heavy with fruit, fields lined with corn taller than a man, and barns painted a bright, cheerful red. It was unlike anything Carlo had ever seen in Europe, where the war had stripped the land bare and left cities gray and hollow. At the station, American guards in neatly pressed olive-drab uniforms guided the men toward trucks that would carry them to Camp Atterbury. Barbed wire fences and sentry towers enclosed the sprawling camp, but the order and cleanliness of the grounds immediately struck Carlo. Each barracks was painted, well ventilated, and lined with cots and fresh blankets. The scent of pine from the camp's trees mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread from the mess hall. Inside the mess hall, Carlo's companions whispered in disbelief. Plates were piled with eggs, sausages, milk, and fruit, rations that outstripped anything they had known in Italy or on the front lines. The Geneva Convention called for minimum standards, but the Americans exceeded them by miles. Each man received roughly 3,500 calories per day, equivalent to what an American soldier consumed, and meals were supplemented with fresh fruit, canned peaches, and chocolate bars. Carlo bit into an orange, the juice spilling down his chin, and felt a quiet shock. This was no mere survival, it was abundance. Sister Angela, who had traveled to inspect the camp through Red Cross reports, walked the rows of barracks with quiet amazement. She saw men carving benches and decorating mess halls, musicians rehearsing in makeshift orchestras, and chapels being painted with meticulous care. Prisoners were allowed to work in the orchards, learn English, and even earn small wages while performing agricultural labor or assisting in depots. It was freedom measured within fences, a paradox that confounded expectations. Carlo noticed the contrast sharply. Back in Tunisia, an M13/40 tank weighed 13 tons, barely armed, underpowered, and often abandoned for lack of fuel. Here, the Americans produced an M4 Sherman every 20 minutes. A single Liberty ship had carried them across the ocean. Factories on the home front produced thousands of aircraft, trucks, and shells every month. One day's production in Detroit, he had heard from guards, could exceed the annual output of entire Italian industries. It was a reality that humbled him as much as it relieved him. By evening, the prisoners settled into their bunks, exhausted from travel, yet buzzing with whispered commentary. The air smelled of hay, wood smoke, and pine. Carlo lay awake, tasting chocolate and orange juice still lingering on his tongue, and realized the war had delivered him into a world of abundance that would forever alter his understanding of America. As the sun set, the orchards shimmered gold in the fading light, a quiet testament to a nation capable of supplying its soldiers, prisoners, and allies alike with enough to astonish even the enemy. Sergeant James O'Donnell leaned against the mess hall railing, chewing on the end of a pencil as he watched the Italian prisoners file in for dinner. The sun had begun its slow descent over Camp Atterbury, casting long shadows across the neatly mowed lawns and orchard rows. To O'Donnell, it was a routine evening of guard duty, yet the scene before him carried a quiet weight. Men who had fought him hours ago were now pausing politely, sharing the same space and receiving the same care as his own division. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a Hershey bar, a small, sweet gesture that had become his signature among the prisoners. "Here," he said, offering it to Carlo Bianchi, who looked at the candy as though it were some miraculous object from another planet. Carlo hesitated, then accepted it with both hands, breaking a piece and savoring it slowly, eyes wide. Around them, others received oranges, milk, and canned peaches. O'Donnell noted the almost audible disbelief in their murmurs. They had come expecting deprivation, perhaps cruelty, and instead found abundance. The sergeant reflected on the scale of what they were witnessing. Each prisoner received roughly 3,500 calories per day, the same as a GI, with clothing, blankets, and medical care, provided without complaint. The barracks were clean, ventilated, and secure, and men were even allowed to work in the orchards or assist in depots for wages. It was logistics meeting mercy, an orchestration of efficiency that his commanding officers in the Quartermaster Corps had perfected. O'Donnell knew that Liberty ships had carried these men across the Atlantic, but the factories back home, the Detroit tank plants, the aircraft lines in Dayton, the ammunition plants in Pennsylvania, were what made this level of care possible. One day's production could eclipse Italy's output for an entire month, a fact that never failed to impress him. As Carlo unwrapped another piece of chocolate, O'Donnell noticed how quickly fear had given way to curiosity and, gradually, to tentative trust. The prisoners examined the equipment, asked questions about American rations, and even laughed when offered small privileges. He realized that generosity could be weaponized. It disarmed the enemy not through fire, but through astonishment. The Axis soldier, trained to expect deprivation and brutality, was instead confronted by the quiet, unyielding abundance of an industrial democracy. O'Donnell glanced at the orchards beyond the fence, the rows of corn and fruit trees glowing in the fading light. He thought of the Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, of tanks rolling from assembly lines, of chocolate bars in the hands of former enemies. The war, he knew, was being won not only on the battlefield, but in these small, human moments. Each bar of chocolate, each meal, each blanket was a tangible proof of American strength. Carlo smiled at the sergeant, his eyes reflecting both surprise and a strange gratitude. In that instant, the two men, once on opposite sides of a desert battlefield, understood the same truth. America fought not only with steel and fire, but with abundance, precision, and a scale of generosity that the world had never seen. The morning sun bathed Camp Atterbury in a soft, golden light as Carlo Bianchi stepped out of the barracks and into the orchard. The air smelled of pine and freshly tilled soil, an aroma so foreign he almost questioned whether he had truly left the desert behind. Around him, other prisoners carried brushes and buckets of paint, setting to work on the small chapel that had been allocated to them. It was a gesture that would have been unthinkable on the battlefields of Tunisia. Men who had once tried to kill each other were now given tools, time, and space to create beauty. Sister Angela, visiting the camp to assist with Red Cross inspections, watched quietly from the path. The Italians were methodical, smoothing plaster and carefully tracing religious frescoes on the walls. Musicians rehearsed quietly in an adjacent hall, their violins and flutes weaving a gentle counterpoint to the clatter of hammers and paintbrushes. Prisoners sang hymns, practiced translations of Latin passages, and debated the correct shades for angel wings. It was a harmony of devotion, skill, and discipline. Carlo paused to consider the irony. The M13/40 tank he had commanded weighed 13 tons and had crumbled under the Sherman's 75mm gun. Yet here he was, using resources Americans had provided to create a lasting symbol of hope. The Americans had delivered not only his physical survival, but the tools to reclaim some measure of humanity, and the POWs seized the opportunity with quiet gratitude. The camp itself was a testament to industrial power applied with foresight. Barracks had been prefabricated in Ohio, shipped by Liberty ships, and assembled in days. Electrical wiring, plumbing, paint, and even brushes had all crossed the Atlantic in careful coordination, with factories producing tanks, trucks, and aircraft in quantities the Axis could scarcely imagine. One day of production in Detroit, Harris had said, could surpass the total yearly output of the Italian tank industry. It was abundance made manifest in bricks, mortar, and pigments. Prisoners moved through the orchard, carrying ladders, mixing plaster, and collecting fresh milk from nearby cows. Some worked in the mess hall, preparing meals for fellow POWs, while others tended the vegetable gardens, ensuring that the camp could supplement its rations. Every task, no matter how mundane, was a lesson in efficiency and care. The Italians began to understand that American military power extended beyond weapons. It encompassed infrastructure, organization, and the moral decision to treat even enemies with dignity. By afternoon, the chapel walls glowed with color, angels suspended mid-flight, saints in robes of azure and crimson. Carlo stepped back and inhaled the scent of paint, sawdust, and sun-warmed earth. It was a moment of stillness amid the war, a pause in which the scale of American industrial democracy became visible not in numbers on a ledger, but in human hands transformed by opportunity and abundance. The day ended with the prisoners stepping back to admire their work, brushes set down, palms smeared with color, and hearts full of quiet astonishment. The roar of machinery echoed through the vast Detroit factory as Major William Harris walked the steel floors, his boots clanging against the grating. Rows of M4 Sherman tanks rolled steadily toward the shipping docks, each chassis inspected, each turret fitted with precision, every engine tested before departure. The scale of the operation was staggering. Harris paused to note the numbers. A single tank rolled off the line every 20 minutes, enough in a single day to equip a regiment, while Italy struggled to assemble a handful in a month. He moved past aircraft assembly lines, where P-51 Mustangs gleamed under overhead lights, fuselages polished, wings attached with meticulous care. The workforce was a symphony of motion, men and women, civilians drafted into the war effort, riveted armor plates, welded fuselages, tested engines, and loaded ammunition into crates for shipment. Harris had spent months coordinating logistics, but seeing production in motion made the scale undeniable. The war, he thought, was being won in these factories as much as on the battlefield. In a side corridor, an American engineer explained the efficiency of the Liberty ships that transported men and materiel across the Atlantic. One convoy can carry 1,000 tons of rations, vehicles, and POWs, he said. We can replace losses faster than the enemy can count them. Harris nodded. He had already calculated that one day's production of Sherman tanks and ammunition exceeded Italy's total monthly output. One factory alone could outproduce entire Axis nations in key areas. The statistic was almost impossible, yet it explained what the prisoners in Indiana were beginning to realize. America's abundance was a weapon as lethal as the Sherman's 75mm gun. Harris passed a line of riveters assembling hulls for another series of tanks. Sparks flew from welding torches, a shower of light and sound that illuminated the dedication and precision of the workers. Engineers shouted instructions in rhythm with hammers and presses, while foremen checked each specification against meticulous blueprints. Every movement, every torque applied to a bolt ensured that tanks and aircraft would arrive intact, ready for battle. He thought of the prisoners at Camp Atterbury, Carlo, and the hundreds of others, receiving full meals, clean blankets, and medical care. None of it was accidental. The factories, the transport ships, the orchestration of personnel and material created the conditions for American victory. They transformed scarcity into abundance, turning logistical mastery into a weapon against enemy morale. As Harris walked to the shipping dock, a Sherman rolled past, engine humming, tracks leaving deep impressions in the concrete. Beyond the fences, the prisoners would soon witness the fruits of this industrial might, understanding for the first time the scale of the nation they faced. It was a truth no propaganda could conceal. American democracy had turned production into power, and power into survival, not only for soldiers, but for captured enemies, reshaping their perception of a world they had once assumed was implacably hostile. The morning sun slanted across the orchards at Camp Atterbury, warming the dew on apple trees and corn stalks taller than Carlo Bianchi. He bent to pluck an orange from a low-hanging branch, the skin smooth and heavy in his hand. The sweet citrus scent was unlike anything he had smelled in Tunisia or Rome. It was a fragrance of abundance, of life continuing despite the war that had stolen so much from his homeland. He bit into the fruit, juice running down his chin, and felt a small, astonishing surge of gratitude and disbelief. The POWs had been assigned to agricultural details to supplement the camp's food supply and to provide meaningful labor. They gathered eggs from hens in neat coops, milked cows, and tended gardens of potatoes and carrots. Each task carried a strange combination of responsibility and leisure. The Americans trusted them with resources, provided tools, and even paid wages, typically 80 cents per day, a small sum that felt enormous to men accustomed to hunger and scarcity. Carlo laughed quietly as he handed a crate of eggs to another prisoner. They were building their own sustenance in a way, under the supervision of men who had been their enemies only weeks before. He noticed the irony in the simplest details. The barns were stocked with equipment that dwarfed anything in Tunisia, from tractors to plows. The poultry alone outnumbered the total chickens Carlo's hometown had ever seen. Yet the Americans did not hoard these resources. They shared them, extending the logic of abundance into every corner of camp life. For the prisoners, the lesson was unavoidable. America's strength was not just in tanks or planes, but in its capacity to generate and distribute wealth and food on a scale that Italy could never match. Sister Angela, who visited frequently, observed the prisoners' transformation. Men once tense and distrustful moved with purpose, working side by side with guards in casual conversation. They learned English terms for tools and crops, kept precise records of harvests, and even taught younger prisoners methods from their own villages. It was education interwoven with labor, practical and subtle, and it underscored a simple, disarming truth. The Americans were organized, capable, and overwhelmingly abundant. Carlo paused to watch a line of trucks transporting crates of eggs back to the mess hall. Each crate represented nourishment for dozens of men, yet the scale of production was almost unbelievable. One day's harvest and livestock output in Indiana could feed hundreds of POWs, supplementing rations sent from across the Atlantic. He realized that this abundance, administered with care and efficiency, was itself a weapon of war. It eroded fear, replaced suspicion with respect, and reshaped enemy perception from within. By evening, the prisoners gathered to compare wages and discuss their work. Carlo counted his earnings in amazement, the small pile of coins symbolizing a new reality. Even captives could live with dignity, eat well, and contribute. The scent of citrus, fresh eggs, and milk lingered in the air, a quiet, tangible testament to a nation whose industrial democracy could defeat totalitarian scarcity without firing a shot. Carlo Bianchi sat at a wooden table in the Camp Atterbury mess hall, staring at a ledger filled with figures that seemed impossible. A guard had shown him production charts from Detroit factories. 120 M4 Sherman tanks built in a single day, 10,000 aircraft produced in 1 month, and ammunition stockpiles capable of sustaining entire armies indefinitely. Carlo traced the inked columns with trembling fingers. He had fought through Tunisia with his M13/40 tank, a 13-ton relic underarmed and underprotected, abandoned more times than it moved. Now he realized the Axis had never stood a chance against a machine of such scale. Sister Angela, visiting to oversee Red Cross inspections, noted the astonishment etched on his face. "Numbers," she whispered. "That should terrify, but also teach." It was not just arithmetic. It was the story of a nation whose industrial democracy had transformed supply and care into weapons. Carlo remembered the chocolate bars, the peaches, the fresh bread, and the eggs he had consumed. Luxuries in Tunisia, now provided casually. One day's chocolate production in Pennsylvania could feed thousands, more than an entire Italian division in the desert had ever seen. Across the hall, other prisoners murmured in disbelief, comparing orchards, mess halls, and barracks with their memories of Italy's scarcity. The war had not been lost on the battlefield alone. It had been lost in factories, shipping yards, and meticulously calculated rations. Liberty ships carried thousands of tons of tanks, trucks, and food across a hostile Atlantic with surgical precision. Every number, every chart, revealed a truth that reshaped their understanding. American abundance was a weapon as decisive as any gun. By evening, Carlo leaned back, ledger closed. The Americans had fought not only with steel and fire, but with chocolate, peaches, and meticulous planning. Victory, he realized, was as much about industrial mastery and organization as it was about courage. The Axis soldiers who survived would carry this lesson far beyond the Midwest orchards. A nation capable of sustaining enemies while equipping its armies could not be defeated. The next morning, Carlo walked past the orchard, observing prisoners carrying crates of milk, eggs, and vegetables with the casual efficiency of longtime workers. American soldiers greeted them politely, exchanging small talk and jokes. Carlo could no longer reconcile the stories Mussolini had drilled into them, that Americans were soft, inexperienced, and incapable of hardship. The reality was shocking. Here was a democracy, messy and decentralized, yet capable of organizing production, transport, and care on a scale Italy had never imagined. Sister Angela accompanied him along the path, and they watched a group of POWs construct a small greenhouse, painting beams and installing glass panels with care. "It is remarkable," she said quietly, "how power can be wielded not by fear, but by abundance." Carlo nodded. He thought back to Tunisia, to starving soldiers and abandoned tanks, and realized that the Axis ideology of sacrifice and austerity had been systematically overwhelmed by the American model: organized, generous, unstoppable. Every aspect of camp life reflected this truth. Barracks were heated, ventilated, and stocked with supplies. Meals exceeded the caloric intake of soldiers in combat zones back home. Prisoners earned small wages tending orchards and gardens. Even their labor contributed to sustaining the camp and local communities. One Italian whispered to Carlo that the rations alone, the eggs, oranges, chocolate, and milk, would have sustained an entire battalion in Tunisia for a month. The reality of American abundance was rewriting their understanding of military power, proving that logistics and care could be just as decisive as bullets. As Carlo walked past the fences, he saw the Liberty ships docked in the distance. Each represented hundreds of tanks, trucks, and tons of rations arriving weekly, all part of a system that the Axis could neither disrupt nor replicate. For the first time, he understood that the war had been lost long before the desert battles. The Americans had dethroned ideology with reality, overwhelming the Axis not only on the battlefield, but through sheer productive capacity. By the end of the day, Carlo's awe had transformed into quiet respect. He looked at the Americans, not as enemies, but as a nation whose industrial democracy had produced victory through organization, abundance, and foresight. Months later, Carlo would recall the orchards, the chocolate, and the orderly barracks of Camp Atterbury with a sense of disbelief and reverence. The war in North Africa was long over, yet its lessons lingered. In his mind, the statistics remained vivid. One Detroit factory producing more tanks in a week than Italy could field in a year, Liberty ships ferrying thousands of tons of rations across a hostile ocean, and 275,000 Axis troops captured in North Africa, receiving full care and sustenance in American camps. The numbers were staggering, almost impossible, yet they were reality. Carlo reflected on the human side as well. The Italian prisoners he had shared barracks with were no longer just enemies. They were witnesses to a new model of power. Soldiers who had expected cruelty had received care. Men who had faced starvation had eaten fruit, eggs, and chocolate in abundance. Even Sister Angela had marveled at the quiet efficiency and generosity of the American system. Every meal, every blanket, every day of wages was a lesson in how a democratic nation could mobilize its resources to achieve strategic ends without compromising its principles. Looking back, Carlo realized the war had been won not only through battles, but through logistics, industrial capacity, and moral organization. American democracy had turned production into power, abundance into a weapon, and care into a force multiplier. The Axis ideology of austerity, fear, and sacrifice had met a reality too vast to resist. Soldiers, civilians, and prisoners alike had experienced the same lesson. Freedom, industrial might, and organized generosity could outmatch even the most disciplined totalitarian system. The orchards, the chapels, the mess halls, they remained in his memory as symbols of a triumph that was both tangible and human. America's victory was not accidental. It was meticulously planned, abundantly supplied, and courageously implemented by men and women who transformed factories, fields, and ships into instruments of liberation. Carlo understood then, and would carry the knowledge always. The greatest strength of the United States was not just its weapons, but its capacity to combine human effort, industrial power, and moral principle into a force that reshaped the world.